Much for joining again, and welcome to week 2 of Music Psychology Mondays. I'm going to review the first portion of the survey of New York City jazz and improvising musicians taken in 2021. The survey was conducted between June and September of 2021, and there were 111 participants in total, with 6 hand-selected professional career musicians with 11 to 48 years of professional full-time teaching and work and performing experience in New York. So, okay, quick review. The average age of participants was 45 years old. The gender identity breakdown was about 56% male, 37% female, and 5% non-binary. I'm skimming, rounding up percentages to the nearest whole number. We had 72% white, and 8% multiracial, 7% Black, 5% Latino, and about 5% other categories, including Asian, Pacific Islander, and South Asian. Approximate average annual incomes, $27,000 per year, with standard deviation of $18,000. And that was in 2019, before the pandemic. In 2020, respondents reported an average income from music work alone to be an average of $13,000 per year in 2020. I do want to just note, I don't think I noted this last week, but in the upper registers here in 2019 of people reporting income over $40,000 per year, most of these people had full-time teaching appointments or positions maybe within a university, and the majority of others were in the freelance range here. So you can kind of deduce that if you are a freelancer, you're going to make under 60K, generally speaking, but that's not completely, here or there. So, but that was the general kind of report of most participants, so who reported those numbers. In 2020, you can see that a quarter of people, 25%, made less than 1,000. And most were, you can see again, people who had full-time teaching positions, they still managed to make over 20, 40, or 60K. So this, I think, in general, pulled up the average of music in 2020 reported numbers. So had these people, if we were only surveying freelancers, I think the income from 2020 would be much lower than 13,000 per year. But I do think the average was brought up in the numbers in 2020 because of people who had full-time faculty or teaching appointments that brought that average up. So just wanted to note that. Okay, so I did cover last week about unemployment. Almost 40% of musicians did not receive unemployment, and a large number didn't even apply to unemployment. So about 35% didn't even apply, and that implies a group that's so used to being disenfranchised, or maybe they had issues gathering 1099s, and the difficulties of paper trails to even prove that being a musician and laboring as a musician is a viable form of work that is difficult to prove in the state. So that was a breakdown. But however, positively, 60% did receive unemployment from the qualitative interviews of in-depth interviews of people who received unemployment. They did report feeling a bit slighted, that I think on average people reported about $180 per week to live on in the pandemic, which is not a lot, especially in New York City. And, they reported feelings that their, career is not seen as viable from this as well. So that's just a note on unemployment. Okay, all right, I'll keep going forward just to get through things. So types of gigs by genre, you can see most participants reported 35% were jazz musicians, more straight ahead, 16% free improv avant-garde, 15% rock punk hardcore, and then we have a huge breakdown here. And of course, the other category was my favorite category, where everybody filled out the form and was very detailed in their description, like, I am a jungle DJ, trumpet, electronic effects player, or, you know, I am this or that. And so we have like quite a more detailed breakdown here. And primary, it's interesting to see this as like the types of gigs people are primarily working, and maybe not the type of music that they focused on or trained for, or identify as personally. Okay, and participants by instrument, we have the rhythm section as the largest group at almost 50%, 25% horn players, 10%, 11% vocalists, and then we have a almost around 15% of electronics, audio, computer processing people, other instruments like theremin, on Martineau, etc., and various other instruments as well. So, okay, and primary role, we have largely side musicians and band leaders who identify their primary role in music work. And I'll just keep going just so we can keep going forward the survey so that we can have a nice discussion after. And I do think this one is nice to note that the primary income is about 60% reported freelance, and almost 30% reported some kind of other day job or side job, and 5% reported, less than 5% reported union contracts and Broadway gigs as a primary income source, and under 2% reported royalties and residuals as a primary income source. So I think that's a really important data piece to have in terms of labor statistics and to empower and help musicians. So there's a bit more on music releases and happiness. So you can check this out on YouTube from the first session, but I'm going to jump ahead. You know, I did sample them on, you know, positive and negative emotions while improvising, kind of interesting, and general happiness and sad levels in the past 2 weeks, which is a common psychology research index. So yeah, okay, I will move ahead, picking up on, we were on question 12. So how often in the past 2 weeks did musicians report being totally engaged in what they were improvising? So complete immersion. And we had the large category reporting often here in the upper structures. So about it's almost 80% saying often, almost all the time, were completely immersed, engrossed in what they were improvising. And this was a curious question because when we measure people's well-being and happiness, there's a 5-point scale called PERMA, which is invented by Martin Seligman, a positive psychology researcher at Penn, I believe, who talks about the PERMA scale of happiness being measured by P standing for positive emotions, E standing for engagement or flow state, because when we're in a flow state, we're in our optimal state of flow. And that was coined by a 1970s Hungarian psychologist named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who actually stole it from jazz musicians. So engagement or flow state. So P for positive emotions, E for engagement or flow state, R for relationships, M for meaning, and A for accomplishment. So yeah, you can see here there's a happiness from the engagement of improvisation. And how often in the past 2 weeks have you experienced a positive relationship or social experience relating to having an improvisational practice? So this is measuring the relationship category on the 5-point scale. And you can look at here again, we have often or almost all the time. So it's almost 70% here reporting positive relationship and social experience. We do have also reports of sometimes, rarely, and never experiencing positive relationships or social experiences relating to having an improvisational practice. So, but in largely, it's a positive report, and the majority is reporting well on this. But I do think that, is not all inclusive, and personally, I was more interested in the stresses that musicians experience in group or in community or as an ethnography. Okay, so let's keep going here. 14. Have you experienced a negative relationship or social impact while having an improvisational practice, such as a disagreement in rehearsal or creative differences, or maybe a fight with a bandmate? Here you can see 22% said never, 40% said rarely, almost 30% said sometimes, and then we have a small majority saying often or almost all the time. So that's generally good that not the majority is reporting issues with disagreements and negative social impact. Okay, let's go into question 15. How often in the past weeks have you engaged in a meaningful activity? And this is music or otherwise. So this, I wanted to get a feel for how people reported feeling if there was like a balance in life. Sometimes I think freelance musicians get so much in a bubble just trying to survive and need each other, right? And jazz is a social music. We need each other to exist, to play together. So this is kind of an interesting report here from maybe a research perspective, at least, that from enjoying a meaningful activity, you can see there's often or almost all the time. Looking back on this survey question design, I might have asked a different question with the limited questions I had, but it is kind of an interesting measure. Okay, so let's keep going. 16. How often in the past 2 weeks have New York City jazz musicians accomplished a musical or music admin goal? So something relating to a goal that, keeps our careers going, our, gigs or income or production of music or releases or etc. And so you can see largely reporting back often and almost all the time. And we have smaller categories reporting sometimes, rarely, and never. Research reflects that musicians are very, very hardworking group and category, and oftentimes a lot of employers want musicians because they know they work very hard. Okay, and so let's keep going. Favorite well-being activities of New York City jazz musicians. This is actually one of my favorite questions out of the whole survey. I wanted to see what jazz musicians in New York enjoyed outside of music, and if music was, for example, they considered it part of their relaxation as well as work. So this is really fun here. You can see that 7% reported yoga, dancing, or other somatic mind-body movement as their favorite activity for well-being. 8% reported meditation. We had 9 people reporting meditation, which is one of my favorites personally. Then we had 9% people reported therapy or mental health counseling as their favorite well-being activity to balance their life. And then 12%, actually more people reported listening to music was their favorite well-being activity, more so than therapy, meditation, or yoga. And then a large number, almost 20%, actually listed practicing their instrument was their favorite well-being activity, and 30% said exercise. So we have a lot of exercisers in jazz musicians as a group. And then we also had 14% listing other activities that they enjoyed as well. So all in all, we can kind of deduce that musicians do prefer listening to music and practicing their instrument and exercise more often than therapy, meditation, or yoga. So I thought that was really really interesting to me, because I'm definitely, I like to enjoy, personally, I like yoga, meditation, to kind of escape maybe stresses of gigs personally. So yeah, that was fun, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Okay, all right, moving forward. So 18, Perma, which of the following aspects of being a musician is most rewarding to New York City jazz musicians? So here we have largest number reported the experience of being in a flow state while playing. And this is quite interesting because it just sort of proves the optimal state of jazz, and from improvising and being in a transcendental consciousness, and that attracts us as a group to jazz. So this was quite interesting to see. And then the second largest category was relationships, so the social aspect of it. And I think I mentioned this last week, that on the PERMA scale in the research, classical musicians reported higher levels in the meaning and accomplishment categories, whereas jazz musicians here most often frequently report gaining pleasure and well-being from relationships and the experience of being in a flow state from the music. So I thought that was interesting. It's a difference between jazz and classical musicians. So in terms of the rewards from playing music. So, and again, P is for positive emotions experienced playing while music, that's 10%. And then we had 11% or 12% reporting internal accomplishment from meeting your own musical goals. So we have people who enjoy the accomplishment aspect from accomplishing something in music. And then we also have 20%, almost 20% reporting the meaning and purpose that playing music gives them. So yeah, so that is question 18. Okay, let's keep going. So 19, we have, I did more of a survey on meditation here, since there's so many mental health benefits of meditation. And so I asked New York City jazz musicians, how often do you meditate? And a large number, 30%, actually reported they never meditate, and they may have tried it. They either never meditated or they may have tried it. And then 18% said they do, but rarely, very rarely meditate. 15% report it's a daily activity to meditate. And then 14% reported they sometimes meditate. 13% of New York City jazz musicians reported often meditating, and 7% flat out never tried it and never meditated. So I think all in all, you can see there's quite a middle body of about, that might be like 50–60% of New York City jazz musicians have meditated, from a range of often meditating, sometimes, or here and there. But I think it's interesting, 15% do it as a daily lifestyle. And I think this is an interesting piece of data, because to be a New York City jazz musician requires putting so many moving parts and organizing all the time. So I wanted to get an understanding on how people are managing their well-being, and if meditation helped them. So I thought this was an interesting piece. Okay, let's keep going. All right, we got about 15 minutes, so I think I'll do a couple more questions here. We can get on to mental health. So here's really the big gun data here. So have New York City jazz musicians suffered high levels of anxiety? So I'm surveying anxiety and depression. And so we have a staggering 80% have suffered from high anxiety. And about 20% of New York City jazz musicians have never had high anxiety. But you can compare this to the national rates of anxiety, and even the rates of anxiety and depression, mental health in New York. In New York, from the Office of the Mayor statistics, 1 in 5 New Yorkers struggle with anxiety and depression. So by contrast here, we have about 4 out of 5 jazz musicians suffer from high anxiety. This is so 80% in New York. And this is actually, you can compare it to a study in the UK done by Gross and Musgraves in 2016 of musicians in the UK. It was the largest survey conducted of mental health of musicians. About 22,000 musicians were sampled, and they reported about 71, 72% suffering high anxiety. So similar high rates of anxiety and depression all around from the UK and then New York. So my survey reported higher levels of anxiety at 80%. In the UK, it was 70%, and that might be a difference because they had a greater sample size as well. So my survey only had 111 participants, so you can kind of think about that. Okay, next, so diagnosed anxiety disorders and treatment access. This is just another breakdown of the same graph. You can see the levels of treatment that people received. So they may have been diagnosed with a clinical anxiety disorder, and that was about 20%, and they received treatment. Later in the survey, I do have a piece that shows only 19% of New York City jazz musicians have access to mental health care that's fully covered. Yeah. And then we have 20% breakdown of people who received treatment, and 25% did not receive treatment. And 5% reported they have high levels of anxiety, but didn't seek treatment because due to lack of access or affordability. Yeah, so this is just more particulars on who had access, who did not have access to treatment, and how in general as a group we're doing. Okay, next, depression. So similar levels of depression, we have over 80% reporting depression. And again, the figure of 4 out of 5 jazz musicians suffering from depression compared to 1 out of 5 New Yorkers suffering from anxiety or depression. I do want to note that the clinical diagnosis of depression, meaning long-term, over three to 6 months, having the blues, being clinically diagnosed by a healthcare provider is different than maybe a self-diagnosis. And this is the first data points that I encountered out of my 2-year literature review. And so I felt this is really important to survey. So you can see this portion here, 26% have been diagnosed clinically with depression, and they received treatment, thank God, which is great. And then we do have other categories here who did have a diagnosis of depression in some form, whether clinical or not, and received treatment or did not. So you can see the breakdowns here. And here's another graph of this here. So just let you take that in. And so those are the rates of anxiety, depression. And I think it's important to note that the national rate of clinically diagnosed depression is 18%. So we, as a category, full-time musicians living in New York are dealing with quite high rates of anxiety and depression compared to the general population in the US and the general population in New York. So the national average is 18%, New York is 20%, and jazz musicians as a whole is about 80% dealing with anxiety and depression. So, you know, we do have a lot of evidence for this. And this is also similar to the report in the depression rates in the Gross and Musgraves survey, which I can show you as well, the results from, and I believe I sent to everybody on the email, and I can send that again if you want to take a look at the UK study. Okay, so all right, let's do one last question of the day, and then we can have a little discussion. So question 22, have New York City musicians ever suffered panic attacks? Luckily, a majority, 40% said no as a category, but the overwhelming 60% said yes. And or rather 50% said yes, and 10% said they weren't sure. And of the people that reported having panic attacks, of half of us, 20% reported that they could not find access to treatment, and they self-medicated as a response to take care of themselves. 15% reported that they did receive treatment, and another category reported other findings, or other whether they received treatment or not. So further research needs to be done for that data. But we do have 40% did not report suffering panic attacks. And the panic attack statistic, this is also similar to the UK study. So it is interesting to note that musicians in the UK and New York are reporting similar reports on anxiety, depression, and panic attacks. Okay, and lastly, I will show the slide on mental health counseling access of New York City musicians here. So New York City jazz musicians reported about, let's see, we have a breakdown here. Which one can I start with? So 6% reported they didn't have insurance access or couldn't afford mental health counseling. 21% reported they pay out of pocket for mental health care with a licensed professional. 19% reported that their insurance fully covers mental health care and they use it without issues to access or affordability. So that's the most positive categories. Yes, your mental health care is fully covered, luckily. And I suspect that requires, since we have such a low income as a group, there's quite a lot to prove to qualify to get those sorts of things covered. So, you know, and I can relate personally. So then we have 30% reported that their health insurance covered mental health care, but there were issues of access or affordability. And then 6% reported their insurance does not cover mental health care at all, and 18% reported another category. So all in all, we have about a solid 20% have strong, affordable access that's covered to mental health care. And then we have 50% have insurance but can't totally have affordable, complete covered access, or they pay out of pocket. And then 6%, excuse me, the other categories, that's the remaining 25% about, report having issues to access. So, okay, I'm going to stop there. We're almost at time. So I want to welcome you all to comment and discuss. And yeah, how's everybody doing? Are we okay? Sorry if I'm talking too fast or going through the slides too fast, but I did want to try to get through as much data as I could. So yeah, are there any questions? Yeah, Tanya.